Welcome to the Economic and Political History Podcast, where we discuss the latest ideas on the intersection of economics, political science, and history. Everyone, welcome to a new episode of the Economic and Political History Podcast. I'm your host, Javier Mejia, and today I have the great pleasure of being with Dale Copeland. He's professor of international relations at the University of Virginia, and he's the author of this recently published book by Princeton University Press. It's called A World Safe for Commerce, American Foreign Policy from the Revolution to the Rise of China. Dale, how are you? I'm very happy of having you here.
Great to be here, Javier.
Let me ask you a first question related to your career. I know you're Canadian, and I know you went to do your PhD in Chicago, but I also know that you had a pretty exciting and, unexpected road before getting interested in international relations. Tell me a bit about that.
Well, I'm from British Columbia, but I went to school in what Canadians call the East, which is really Ontario. And I started in pre-med. I like sciences. Then I didn't want to be a doctor, so I switched to commerce and economics and got a degree there, and then went to Toronto, the hub of business in Canada, to work for a big multinational corporation called Warner Lambert for a couple of years as a marketing executive. I learned a lot about what it means to do power politics in the oligopolistic world of big corporations. So that was actually a good learning experience. But I decided I wanted to do something more with my life. So I quit and went and studied philosophy and a bit of international relations at the University of Toronto just for a year. And I got into a master's program at the School of Advanced International Studies in Washington, D.C., and I actually backpacked around the world for a year, mostly Asia, just because I wanted to know more about the world before I studied international relations. 7 weeks in China, for example, with just a backpack. And so it was fascinating for me to learn about Asia and especially China. And that has served me well. And then I went to do a PhD at the ripe old age of 28 at the University of Chicago. And now I've been a professor here at the University of Virginia for almost 3 decades. Yeah, so it's been quite a varied route, but really useful because I like to draw from a lot of different aspects or areas of study, including culture, but also economics and history.
How important was that trip for you for your career? I mean, I guess that probably it worked in a subliminal way, but do you think there's something that happened during the trip that shaped your way of thinking about, I guess, what later would be your work?
Yeah, well, what's interesting, Javier, is that at Warner Lambert in Toronto, I was the head of the company that was the number one company in their particular products. But we were always worried about the rising actors, if you will, the rising states in my first book. And so I got this view of the world about how it feels to be a declining power facing rising states. But when I went to China, actually I started in Japan, Southeast Asia, and then I went back to China during the spring. And it was before Tiananmen Square, actually. And it was fascinating because all the reforms were going on and nobody was frightened of talking to foreigners. So I learned enough Mandarin very quickly. I tend to be able to speak languages better than I can hear them. So I learned enough Mandarin to get around, stay in Chinese hotels, and talk with people on the street. And they would invite me into their homes. It was an amazingly free and open period of time. And that was quite life-changing because I got to talk to doctors. I got to talk to students. I even taught a class in English at a Chinese English language school just for a couple of days, just for fun. They invited me in. So I got to know people on the ground and really learned in a way that what happens at the power political level is not necessarily what the average person sees, which is kind of obvious. But I also had other experiences that were formative in Tokyo. Actually, it was in Kyoto, in Japan. I got to study Zen Buddhism at a monastery for about 3 days. And then when I went to Southeast Asia, I studied Islam. Just because I'm interested and I wanted to learn more about all these different cultures. So as I often say on my X site, I'm not a Christian, Muslim, Buddhist, or say a Hindu. I'm all of those. I like to think of myself as a mixture of those insights. So when I went to India at the tail end of all of this, and Nepal, I studied Hinduism, not directly, but just by watching and learning with a number of people who were, very interested in talking with me in English, of course, in India. And Varanasi or Benares was the center of that. So in a way, that was kind of a way to throw myself in the deep end of international relations on a one-on-one basis. And in fact, sometimes it would work because I was traveling by myself, that I would get invited into places just to hang with people. And in Bangkok, of all places, the first day I arrived, checked into the hotel, went to this monastery, and they're beautiful temples, the golden temples. And this couple, these two monks at a monastery invited me to stay with them for 5 days. So I went to a monastery and studied a little bit of Thai Buddhism, but in fact, it was mostly just social. They just wanted to chit-chat with me more than anything. So it was a rich experience. And when I got to SAIS, the School of Advanced International Studies in Washington, even though I didn't have an international relations background, I had one course from Toronto in it. I was mostly as business and economics. I felt I had at least a background in understanding cultures and the way people think. So that was important.
It's true that international relations is a field that requires such a broad background and knowledge that, I struggle to imagine that many other type of experiences that could be so enriching as the ones you're describing. But how about if we began getting into your book following that line, and why don't you help us, those of us who are not in international relations, to understand the big theoretical discussion, right? So you're a realist. What does that mean? What is that in contrast to what, which is going to be liberal ideas? What's that theoretical debate, and where are you located at? And I want to add something about it, because this is something that I found quite interesting, which is that you argue that you're realistic, or how should I call this? The realism of your view is not prevalent in the U.S. So I'm also curious about why is that the case?
Sure.
Please guide us.
Remind me of that when
discussion.
Remind me of that after I outline the argument, because I might forget. But the way to think about the international relations field, and it's simplified, but it's rather accurate, is that there are two ways of doing international relations. One is to look at the particular actor you're trying to explain. I call it state Y, just to, for convenience, and look at how state Y looks, or the leaders of state Y look at the external factors outside that state in terms of determining their policy. So changes in relative power, changes in technology abroad, changes in commerce and levels of interdependence or trade dependence or financial dependence. That's one general way, and we often call it the power political way of realism, realist theory. But there are different types of realism we can get into. The second big way is to look internal to the state, to state Y, and ask the question, what are the bottom-up forces that are pushing leaders to act in certain ways? Pressures from social conflict, pressures from different parties, pressures to win elections, or even just bureaucracies pushing for certain kinds of policies, maybe that feather their own nests but aren't good for national security. So you can see that those are two logical ways to approach the field. We often call the second one the more liberal approach, but that's just a term. Think of it as external versus internal, and I'm in the external camp here. And what I wanted to show in this book, based around the second book that I had, this is my third book. My second book was on economic interdependence and war. That was its title. And it looked mostly at European and Asian states, great powers from 1790, and asked the question, to what extent does commerce and power politics drive their behavior? Well, in a way, because I was looking at European states and Asian states, it was kind of obvious that I was probably going to find something of importance. We all know that Japan 1941, went to war because it was being cut off from oil and raw materials. But I wanted to really ask the hard question for at least this systemic or realist view, this externalist view. To what extent is U.S. or American foreign policy driven by these external factors like relative power, fear of the future, fear of people cutting us off from oil and raw materials. Because after all, most of us, including most realists, think that America is the exceptional case, the exceptionalist power. It's not driven by the traditional geopolitical realpolitik views. No. It's driven by ideology, by values, by democracy, by liberalism, by straightforwardly party politics. And most realists, actually, as I found doing my research, think that only really the Cold War maybe fits with realism, and they give almost everything else up to the liberal worldview. And they say, oh, it's an exceptional case. So my basic premise was to show, no, that's not true. In fact, ironically, American leaders, right from the get-go, Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, are some of the most realpolitik, realist, rational, maximizing actors that you would want to ever find in world politics. They just do it in a different way. They are very focused on commerce and building the commercial power sphere of the United States. So when that commercial power sphere, like with other great powers, but with the Americans, whenever that commercial power sphere is going well for the Americans, they're happy. They ride the wave. They don't fight wars. They kind of go with the flow and try to grow their power and let other people fight, like World War I, World War II, so that the Americans can come in at the end and, quote unquote, take the peace. Well, what I find, though, is that when the Americans are fearful of the future economically, when they believe they are being cut off from key access to raw materials and markets, or when they think they're going to be in the future, suddenly they turn quite nasty and they actually start wars. War of 1812 was really started by the Americans. So was the war against Mexico, 1846-47, and the war with the Spanish in 1898. Not to mention the question of whether Wilson got into World War I in 1917 for these commercial power-driven reasons rather than, say, making the world safe for democracy. So I flip that on its head, of course, with the title of the very book, and I say, but let's think about this as making the world safe for commerce, namely American commerce, and to what extent is that a good explanation for world politics, or at least the American behavior, for 250 years? Now, I'll just say right up front, I'm not going to try to explain. In fact, I show the examples where this argument doesn't work. There are at least 4 or 5 important cases, including Vietnam in the 1960s, that don't work for this commercially driven logic. But I was actually quite surprised at how many times when I looked at the documents that this commercially driven logic was actually very good and very powerful in explaining U.S. behavior that might have looked like ideology or domestic politics or personality quirks of leaders. It was actually driven by this realpolitik logic that's commercially based. Does that cover the basic logic of the theory for you?
Yeah, certainly. And I want to ask you more about commerce and specifically what it does in your theory. But before that, this just to highlight the novelty and particularities of your theory. How is it different from these other realist ideas out there, right?
That's it. That is important. So if you think about most realists, we have this divide or this level of realism I'm calling systemic or externalist driven. We divide that into offensive realists like John Mearsheimer, very familiar to most, and defensive realists like Stephen Walt and Charlie Glazer and Robert Jervis. And in a nutshell, the offensive realists believe that because of uncertainty about the future, all rational leaders are driven to expand their territorial and military power. They get more and more power because it makes them feel safe. That's John Mearsheimer in a nutshell. But the defensive realists say, oh, watch out, because sometimes when you do that, you create these spirals of misunderstanding and mistrust. You make things escalate that you don't want to escalate, and you get into more crises and wars than you might otherwise. So be cautious, say the defensive realists. Push, say the offensive realists. And in my argument, which I call dynamic realism, I first of all fuse those two realist types together and show under what conditions one or the other impulse might prevail. And then I also bring in something that's neglected in both of those, which is the role of commerce, the role of economic power, and commercial power as the basis, long-term basis, for military and territorial power and security. So that, in a way, is the two innovations that I make relative to realism. But you asked earlier, why are realists kind of punting on the American case, or at least claim that maybe it works for the Cold War but not for other cases? And it's a puzzle for me, to be honest. But I think it largely has to do with this divide between the types of realism. The offensive realists say, well, you always push, so it can't really explain, Mearsheimer, et cetera, these long periods of peace where the Americans aren't pushing that hard and actually are quite engaged in the world, or allow others to engage, like letting China trade for 30 years with the U.S. This is a huge puzzle for Mearsheimer, because he thinks that the world is always a nasty competitive place and we shouldn't do those things. And guess what he does? John Mearsheimer does, he blames the liberals, or at least what he calls the liberals in the bureaucracy, for getting it wrong and doing stupid things, namely trading with China when you shouldn't, according to his theory. Well, that's just saying my theory's wrong, and I'll let liberalism explain that. Well, hey, the other aspect of this is the defensive realists, who say always be moderate, or stay away from exciting the system by provoking China too much or pushing whoever it is too hard. Well, that's good. It's a good insight that that's a risk of power politics. But guess what? It can't explain all the times when the U.S., almost out of the blue, initiates major conflicts like the War of 1812, war with Spain, and to be honest, the Cold War is another one of my cases. This is the U.S. pushing for the Cold War. The Soviets just wanted to buy time and actually get trade from the U.S. to rebuild after the devastations of World War II. So the U.S., it was up to the U.S. to decide, under FDR and not just Truman, to constrain or even contain the Soviet growth, to make sure that we held that balance of power in our favor economically and militarily. And that involves, therefore, thinking like a good realpolitik person. But hey, the defensive realists lean towards moderation, so they can't explain those shifts. So I think both these two types of groups end up saying, well, there's too many unexplained cases in the American situation, so I'll just say that liberalism and these ideologies and domestic pressures were the things that pushed these leaders. Nope. Sometimes they did, and I'm willing to accept that. Andrew Jackson was driven by domestic politics, or by other realist logics that don't involve commerce, like LBJ, Lyndon Johnson in 1964-65. But you'd be amazed, or I was amazed, when you look at the documents, how often it is, going right back to the Revolutionary War against Britain, that this commercial realpolitik, power-driven logic actually works.
So now that, I was waiting to ask you more about commerce, but now that you're mentioning this sort of blind spots of these different theories, and you
pushed me.
Oh, that's great. And you very early on also mentioned that your theory doesn't work great for very specific historical episodes. I'm wondering about the role of randomness and error in your theory. How do you think about this? Because it's frequently, regularly, when you listen to this stories about nuclear conflict, you hear about all these events where things could have went horribly if, like, someone would have just made a tiny mistake. And then I always think about how hard it seems to develop a theory that needs to be robust.
I know.
Are they like all those tiny stochastic events? How do you think about randomness, I guess, is my question within your theory?
It's a great question. And as I say, I combine these insights of offensive and defensive realism. I see actors being pushed by fear of the future to expand what I call their economic power spheres. Think of China with the Belt Road Initiative. It's pushing itself out into Africa, Asia, and even South America, our own backyard, to gain raw materials, gain access to markets. And that has its risks. It pushes the Americans to react, and it creates what we call balancing behavior, this countering of the other's action by increasing our own military, increasing our navy, increasing our restrictions on their commerce. And we're doing that as we speak. We know that we're rebuilding our own navy and keeping up with China's buildup, but we're also, of course, restricting China's access to high-tech semiconductors coming out of Taiwan and coming out of Asia itself, and soon to be coming out of the U.S. And we make sure, or at least we're trying to make sure, that China can't overtake us in that last area, that last frontier, because they've overtaken the U.S. in many other economic frontiers. Well, this is, in a way, a deterministic logic if you're asking about randomness. It's a deterministic logic that says when you fear the future, when you fear the rise of others, you tend to get more nasty in your behavior. But when you're the rising state, like the U.S. was in the 19th century, generally speaking, you like to ride that wave upwards. And you only go to conflict when you feel others are starting to cut you off, which, of course, is what the declining state is going to do. And this was the start of the American Revolution in a nutshell. Britain saw the British North Americans rising in economic power and population, and through what we tend to call taxation without representation, but many other things, including the Quebec Act and the ability of Americans to cross the mountains into Ohio Valley, we the British, here I'm putting my Canadian hat on, we the British kept the Americans down. Well, the Americans did not want to be kept down, and they fought a war over it. So you can see that in a way, there's a element of uncertainty even in the predictions of the model. Will the Americans react strongly to these efforts to keep them down in 1763 to 1775? They did react, and the British were surprised at the ferocity of the reaction. There are a lot of other cases like that where things could have gone a different way. So you might say the argument is probabilistic, not deterministic, insofar as I say that these forces that I'm outlining, these forces of fear of the future, fear of economic decline because of cutoffs in raw materials and markets, can very likely cause actors to be nasty, turn nasty. And that's what I'm worried about with China. We can get into that later, that the Chinese will have a parallel to 1776, and they'll believe the Americans are going to try to keep them down economically, and they might react, attacking Taiwan, Southeast Asia, etc. That's for the future. But what you're really getting at is another aspect of this question of probabilism or randomness, and that is that something inadvertent or uncontrolled by either player might lead them to do something that then spirals out of control. You know, a rogue captain in the Chinese Navy fires a shot that sinks an American ship in the South China Sea. I worry about this, and that Americans feel they have to respond. So another ship, maybe from a plane from an aircraft carrier, fires a shot across the bow that goes wrong and disables that ship that sunk our ship. And the Chinese feel they have to react, and they fire a missile at Guam or something like that. This is the kind of thing we do call inadvertent spiraling. And guess what? The defensive realists are very obsessed with this. They see, for example, World War I as an example where a killing of an Archduke Ferdinand, the Archduke and the person who would take over the Austro-Hungarian throne, is killed in Sarajevo in late June of 1914. And it leads, by spiraling, according to this logic, to a total war that consumes Europe for 4 years and leads to 20 million deaths. Well, if that's true, then we have to worry about this kind of thing happening, of course, in South China Sea or over Taiwan, inadvertent spiraling. Now, here's where I come in. I say that the inadvertent spiraling will probably be only, at least a small crisis will only lead to such inadvertent spiraling if you have a precursor or a history of rising tensions, Cold War logics, thinking about the other as an enemy ready to shoot first and ask questions later. So if that is not the case, think of it USChina 25 years ago, then these small crises can happen and they won't spiral because we say, oh, we trust the other, or we at least understand that this must be a rogue captain. Things go very much differently. Let's think of the Cuban Missile Crisis, when these inadvertent events happen in the midst of very high tensions. In the Cuban Missile Crisis, Black Saturday, October 27th is aptly named because what happened is one of our U-2s got shot down over Cuba, and very many people thought that this would spiral to nuclear war. John F. Kennedy himself said he thought the probability of nuclear war, he told his brother this, was between 1/3 and 1/2 during that time period. So we have to avoid those kinds of things. But the good news is this inadvertent back and forth action-reaction spiraling can be moderated in its likelihood of spiraling to war by sustaining positive expectations of trade on both sides. So bottom line, if you can sustain the others and your own expectations of the future commerce, US-China, for example, avoiding decoupling, avoiding cutting them off from other things, let's say, everyday chips, semiconductors, then you can moderate their fears and you moderate your own at the same time. And you don't allow these stochastic random events to actually lead to an actual war.
It's hard not to let my mind get to China and the U.S. conflict after this answer. But before getting there, and we're going to get there, I would like you to tell us a bit more about the cases you study in the book, right? Sure. So the book has this very interesting historical perspective, and I think it's quite insightful and instructive even. So why don't we start with the 19th century? So it seems to me that that's the whole sort of unit that describes a certain kind of common pattern. How would you describe to someone that is not familiar with the geopolitics of the U.S. during the 19th century? What are the key events? The Spanish-American War seems to be a crucial turning point, although probably then when you see it in the from the point of view of World War I seems small. But anyways.
No, the Spanish-American War is fascinating. We can talk about the U.S.-Mexican War if you want as well, but also the War of 1812. And by the way, Wilson, I'll just say this up front, Wilson got into World War I primarily for fear of Germany trying to get more involved in his backyard, Wilson's backyard, Mexico, South America. And he feared that the Germans, if they won in Europe, would then be able to project control over trade going to South America and the Caribbean. And they even thought, the Americans thought this, and they had good reason to, that the Germans were forming an alliance with Mexico to squeeze the Americans from both sides. But that's only, in some sense, the end of this 120-year period that you're talking about from 1800 to 1917. What was going on prior to that? Well, here's the thing. If you're a rising power, as the Americans were at that time, the British were the dominant naval power and even the commercial power. The Americans had a pretty strong economy even by 1920. But in those early years, they were still the rising power, smaller population than the other great powers. When you're rising, what you want to do is extend your economic tentacles, grab territory when you can that economically benefits you. So crossing the Appalachians, but more than that, going across the Mississippi and taking the rest of the continent, or at least what we call the continent now, and all the way up to, of course, British Columbia, where I'm from. That was a major task, and that has a lot to do, by the way, with the war with Mexico, 1846. We can get to that in a nutshell, but it's largely about the fear that the British would get there first and control California, but also squeeze the Americans from the north, and that the Americans would not have the ports that they needed to extend their commerce all the way to China and to control the valued China market. They knew the British had already had an opium war in 1839 to 42, and the British were primed with Hong Kong to open up China. The Americans needed to get in there, and so Polk, not for slavery, not for domestic reasons, started a war with Mexico, and took 40% of Mexico's territory and all the beautiful ports of the West Coast, all the way to what became Seattle, but of course the already existing ports on the Californian coast. So how does that ratchet up to the very important war in 1898? Well, you have to think about this again in the dynamics of power driven by commerce. The U.S. is still growing. It's still building up its commercial power all through that period. It's industrializing like crazy, even before the Civil War, but especially afterwards. But by the 1890s, what it was seeing in a foreign policy sense is not only the British and the French and even the Germans cutting up Africa and slicing up those colonies and becoming these huge colonial powers with commercial strength and navies to back them up, but they were also starting to, guess what, slice up China. And if you've seen these pictures of the cartoons that were in Punch magazine in Britain, you know that all the European powers were trying to take pieces of the melon, as they say, pieces of the cake, and that was China. Well, long story short, McKinley was being told about this in 1897, 96, 97, by none other than Henry Cabot Lodge, Teddy Roosevelt, who was his assistant secretary of the Navy, and a couple of other very important individuals, and Alfred Thayer Mahan, who we all know and love as loving the British model, but wanting the Americans to apply this to the American situation. Build up your Navy, establish your global commerce, not just your regional commerce. And guess what? There comes along this crisis over Cuba where the Spanish are, trying to solve a civil conflict that the Cubans are pushing. The Cuban people want independence, but there's a lot of people in Cuba that don't want independence. And the Spanish state is basically torn. It's torn by this inability to figure out how to solve the Cuban situation. Long story short here, the Americans decide to exploit this and take Cuba, but in the process of taking Cuba, or at least winning that war, take Puerto Rico to protect the growing effort to create an isthmus canal through Nicaragua or Panama that would join all the industrial strength of the East Coast with the markets of China and the Pacific, and also, of course, to take the Philippines. And the Philippines is taken right from the get-go before the Americans took Cuba. We forget this. But within days of the essentially the declaration of war coming from the Congress in April, the Americans under Dewey, the Commander Dewey, took Manila Bay and basically took the Philippines by proxy. And they got the Philippines through the ultimate treaty with the Spanish. Why the irony here? Because they're doing this for the China markets, but it's the Americans who fought a war in 1760s and 1770s and 80s to gain independence from a colonial power, now becoming a colonial power, and largely for the same commercial reasons that the British set up their British North American colonies way back when. So it's a fascinating case, and it's also a case, guess what, that looks like an inadvertent war, a war that nobody wanted. And it's often called the Great or Splendid Inadvertent War in American history because it looks like domestic pressure is pressuring McKinley. He doesn't know what to do. He makes some mistakes. He goes and pushes the Spanish a bit too hard. They resist. Then the reputations on both sides are engaged, and he's forced into a war. Not one bit true. The evidence is so clear that he manipulated the Spanish into a war that only he wanted, and he wanted it because of commerce. So it's a great case for me, but it's also one of the most difficult cases because almost everyone in my own field and almost every historian who might be watching this will say, oh, well, no, that was an inadvertent war. That was the war of a little spark that led to a crazy thing that nobody wanted. Not true.
No, I mean, that's fascinating. But I guess I'm thinking about how to connect this with the present then. And it seems to me that, so World War I is this big breaking point, and World War II is hard to be understood without World War I. So what is the crucial element to understand there? And then let's talk for a bit about the Cold War. And I think that settles the scenario to talk later about China and the U.S. today.
Yes, definitely. Well, the World War I, World War II period, let's just call it 1900 and 1945, is, of course, a setup for the Cold War that happens right after that. And in a way, the Cold War is not that hard to explain because, after all, Germany and Japan lost those wars. France and Britain, they're devastated by the wars as well. And what was a multipolar, many-power situation becomes a bipolar situation, which we know as the Cold War. U.S. and the Soviet Union are the only two powers that really survive these two major conflicts. Not intact. The Soviet Union was devastated by World War II, but big enough and strong enough to be able to be the superpower of the future. Now, of course, this is part of what's going on here is Russia for a long time is industrializing and catching up to everybody, including the British, the French, and the Germans, and threatening by 1945 to start to catch up with the Soviet Union. And I've covered some of that in my first book, But what's really going on, because the first book does not cover the commerce side of this, but if you want to ask why are states growing so fast or not, and why do they fear decline, it has a lot to do with whether they feel they can get access to commerce that can grow their economies or not. And this was 1917. Wilson felt if he didn't get involved in World War I and defeat Germany, Germany would actually win that war and starve Britain and take Britain's navy, or at least half of the navy, he felt, and then use that to penetrate into our sphere, Western Hemisphere. Now, the war ended well. Britain also was able to recover to some degree from the war from 1914 to 1918. But what happens? Well, we know that in a way World War II is started by Nazi Germany. That's not a surprise. It's a given that Germany wanted that war and nobody else did. But what's interesting to me is how did FDR look at that war that starts in 1939 and try to plan out the future position of the U.S. after the war would end? And here's my take in a nutshell, and there's a huge amount of documentation on this, is, as we all know, FDR did want to get into the war in 1939-40, but he couldn't because of Lindbergh and others, the American firsters, who wanted to keep America out of this conflict. All right, so he had that domestic problem. But even by mid-41, actually mid-40, he was trying to set up a situation where the U.S. would be primely positioned to take the peace after the war was over. How did he envision this? Well, after the French were quickly and unexpectedly defeated in June of 1940, he had the Council on Foreign Relations do many surveys and studies that showed that we could create what was called a grand area, going all the way from Britain through India, Western Europe, through India, China, and Japan, if we could defeat them. And that would allow the U.S. to control or dominate the global commercial system against whoever won the continent. That is, Nazi Germany in 1940 looked like they would win. But by 42, 43, after Stalingrad, it looked like it would be the Soviet Union. So once again, in a nutshell, we had this plan in place from 1940 onwards to control the commercial situation and back it up by, guess what, air bases. By 1943, FDR was already agreeing to the Joint Chiefs of Staff plan to set up air bases surrounding the Soviet Union so that it would be deterred from going after our commercial dominant sphere. I call this the FDR legacy because we still have it today. We still have commercial dominance, and it's up to China and Russia to break out of that, but we have it, and they don't. Well, that is, from the Soviet point of view, in 1944-45, a very unnerving thing. They are the devastated power by 1945. They have lost 27 million people. We've lost 400,000. 1/4 of their industrial structure has been completely destroyed. Their cities have been devastated. What do they want? Guess what? They want trade. They want trade and commerce and loans from this very dominant economic power, the U.S. And we had been giving them those loans, not even loans, they were grants through the Lend-Lease program, direct aid that would help them fight against the Nazis. They expected that to continue. FDR was the one who said, hold on, now that it's a different geopolitical situation, we have to think differently. We don't want them to grow through their economic potential, that power that they have. We don't want them to trade extensively to get our technology. So by early 45, this was still when FDR was alive, but especially once Truman got into power after FDR's death, we deliberately made sure they could not get our trade and technology. And by 1949, now this is with NATO as well, but by 1949, we had almost no trade at all with this huge state called the Soviet Union. And we kept that no trade situation going until really Nixon and Kissinger in 1971-72. So that was a deliberate policy. But what it does in this logic, it's a necessary realpolitik policy to maintain this preponderance of power, to use the words of Mel Leffler, the historian, maintain that preponderance for the long term and not let them grow. Well, the Soviets don't like that, of course, and they recalibrate And by 1946-47, they are already pushing hard on Iran, pushing hard on Turkey, pushing hard on Greece and Italy. So we then have to fight an all-out containment logic. But the containment logic that we call from 1947 onwards was really containment logic that was already in place by 1942-43. And I can even show from documents that William Bullitt, an advisor to FDR, came up with the exact same idea as George Kennan did in 1945-47. He called it an amoeba, which we had to control by setting up barriers. But it was the same logic as George Kennan's containing of this river that the Soviet Union represented. And that geopolitical logic is very realpolitik. It's very much in line with almost everything we think of as nasty geopolitics. But we don't give FDR any credit for that. We think he was naive. We think he gave away the store in Eastern Europe. He didn't. He couldn't do anything about Eastern Europe, so he created this legacy of controlling 3/4 of the world's economy in our favor.
Let's get to the present then. I want to hear about how you think the tensions between China and the U.S. are going to unfold. And I know that you're somewhat optimistic, I guess is probably a good term to describe that position, specifically about Taiwan. What's the deal? How do you see the situation? What do you think are the main arguments and the main forces to be paying attention to the situation?
Well, I think you have to look at the U.S.-China situation in a twofold way. The first is the larger geopolitics of the struggle for global commerce, the struggle that China's also executing in a Mahanian way to build up its navy to protect its global commerce. That's one struggle, and that has an underlying military component, but the Chinese are still what they would concede to be an inferior but rising power that wants to keep growing through trade. And that's the U.S. strategy of the 19th century, and it's the strategy of any rising power. They've been doing it for 40 years, and they still want it to continue. So in a strange sort of way, it's up to the U.S. to decide how much they want to decouple their two economies. That's the larger geostrategy that we want to talk about. Both of them Mahanian-based in the sense of Alfred Thayer Mahan, in the sense of build up commerce, build up your navy to protect your commerce, and keep your military strong because your economic base is so strong. The second dimension is the narrow one of Taiwan and the regional question of Southeast Asia. And that can bring in things that aren't political or even rational, such as the sense of glory or the sense of Xi Jinping having his place in history by unifying Taiwan back into the motherland, or simply the sense that he's being pressured at home by those who want the glory and the sense of a unified, larger, greater China, the China dream of reunification and rejuvenation. Well, that can play its role as well, and that's a variable that's not in my logic. My logic is a rationalist, logic-driven one about power politics. But we can also see to what extent the rational conflicts with the non-rational here, the glory or status-driven motives that fit with Taiwan. And we can ask the question, would a Xi Jinping, at least as we've known him for 10 years, would a Xi Jinping give up all of the growth, all of the benefits of global trade, the 5 or 6% growth he still seems to be getting, maybe 3%, through trade for the glory and status of retaking Taiwan by force? You can see there's an interlinkage between these two realms. And my answer is very short. Very straightforwardly, no, he's not that stupid. He's not Vladimir Putin. And Vladimir Putin, by the way, was not engaged or dependent upon the world economy except through oil exports. And guess what? In 2022, he got increases in oil prices because of the war, because he was disrupting energy markets around the world. So Putin wasn't constrained or contained or deterred by his energy exports. He was actually thinking, hey, this might even be good for them. And in the meantime, I can get my glory and status and stop NATO expansion. So I'm killing 3 birds with one stone, says Putin in February 2022. Xi Jinping is not that foolish, and he's got very different circumstances. Yes, Taiwan's a bit like Ukraine. You'd want to bring it back to the motherland, so to speak. But we know how devastating that war would be. First of all, crossing 100 miles of open ocean is very difficult. The Chinese know this. In fact, they haven't built the landing crafts yet to do the invasion because they know how difficult it would be. What else do they know? They know that the Americans might, through this spiraling process, get involved in a war that leads to an actual fighting war between U.S. and China. Taiwan is not Ukraine. Taiwan has been said to be American and in the American interest for a long time. And it's geostrategically important because it's the access point into the Pacific Ocean for any Chinese Navy. So we would lose that effort or that ability to bottle China up if we lost Taiwan. We want to be involved, and we've said we will be involved. So that's another thing that deters. But the third pillar of what I call the three pillars of deterrence is the economic punishment that the U.S. and the allies could inflict if Taiwan was invaded and we decided to react with economic restrictions. Russia's lost about 5% of its GDP, or maybe 8%, but it's kind of recovered. It's almost back to where it was because of its oil exports. China is dependent on exports and imports of raw materials, 40% of its GDP. Bloomberg News has estimated China would lose 17% of its GDP in 1 year. 1 year, if it were to attack Taiwan, and even if it were successful, because it would also disrupt, guess what, the semiconductor markets that Taiwan is so important to. It wouldn't be able to get access to the raw materials needed to make the semiconductors, so China's industrial structure would fall. So this is the linkage between these two elements. And my bet is that Xi will remain what he's been, a rational Machiavellian who plays this out, and he pushes and he pulls back whenever he needs to. Yes, we're wolf warrior diplomacy. Oh, no, we're not, says Xi to Biden last November. We're, trying to just get along here with you, and we're trying to engage you. And he invites Graham Allison, the author of Destined for War, to Beijing to say, we're open for business. We want your business. We want to cooperate. He's trying to pull back as a good rational actor would when he sees the pushback from his previous wolf warrior diplomacy. So this is Xi Jinping as we've seen him. And my bet is he will, as much as Taiwan is tempting, he's not stupid enough to put 1.2 million men into a very hard, maybe 50-50 chance of invading Taiwan and taking it for the glory of his nation. He's getting the raw materials he needs. He's getting the semiconductors he needs. He's not going to destroy his global commercial realm and his economy and his military and his domestic stability just for the glory of Taiwan. And I'll say one last thing. His two biggest trading partners, of course, are the EU and the United States. Over $700 billion in trade with both of those. And together, even after all is said and done, this is 10 times the amount he trades with Russia. So when we talk about Russia and China having this close economic partnership, Russia doesn't have a lot that the Chinese want, and maybe some raw materials. And straightforwardly, the real markets for Chinese EVs are not Russia. They have their crummy cars with their cheap oil. The EVs are going to the EU and hopefully to the Western Hemisphere. So he's not going to cut off his nose to spite his face, bottom line.
Let me ask you one final question because we don't have much time left, but I don't want to leave without hearing from you about Latin America. Now that you're mentioning these other parts of the world in this dispute, you have some interesting insights about Latin America here. What are those?
Oh, sure. Well, Latin America was designed, we call it Latin America, but we can include, of course, the Caribbean or non-Spanish-speaking parts of South America. Some are French, Dutch-speaking. But the general Western Hemisphere was always seen to be our backyard, at least since the Monroe Doctrine. And why? Because it was a commercial market and a supplier of cheap raw materials and food. That was a great thing. And this, of course, is what spurred Wilson to fight so strongly against Germany in 1917. And how do I know that this is really the key motive? The documents are there, but we also have another interesting aspect of what happened in 1916 when the British started to shut out the Americans from those very same markets, in mostly South America. And the British looked like they were trying to make commercial arrangements with Latin American, Caribbean states to, again, shut out the Americans. We built up our Navy to be second to none. That was in Wilson's terms or words. And guess what? The British got even more angry and started to build up their Navy against us, not just against the Germans. So while the Germans in 1916 were actually playing nice, we actually thought of going to war with, wait for it, Britain. Britain in November 1916. And I can show you the documents or even the pages on the book where this is documented. And this was a shock to a lot of the lower level people, but wasn't a shock to Wilson and to his advisor, Edward House, that we might have to go to war with Britain. And that the British might start the war by invading from Canada, which is a nice little part for me because my dad's from Manitoba, and that's where they were going to. They thought the British and the Japanese would coordinate an attack on America from Manitoba. Long story short, that ended. We got together with the British during the war. We kept that going. We worked with them in the World War II period, of course. But where does Latin America fit in now? What's fascinating to me is that it's our backyard to this day, but the Chinese want in. And they want in for purely economic reasons. This is not the Cuban Missile Crisis kind of thing where the Chinese want to put missiles in some isolated island in the Caribbean. What they want is to push us, not out, but insert themselves into our dominant position economically in the Western Hemisphere. And they're doing a darn good job of it. How are they doing it? By loans. BRI loans, Belt Road Initiative loans. We'll give you cheap money. We'll give them, or sometimes grants. We'll help build your subway systems, Ecuador, Colombia. We'll help build these soybean farms in Brazil. The Chinese tell the Brazilians. And in the Caribbean itself, get this, the Chinese are building a special economic zone in the tiny little island of Antigua, 100,000 people, independent nation. They're building a massive port there with a massive listening station so that they can also monitor what the Americans are doing. They're not foolish. They're not going to bring in missiles. They're not going to bring in the Chinese Navy except for port calls. Port calls are, we're here for a few days. We help, feed some of your people or we give them medical aid. But then we leave. But they're definitely getting their foot in the door for the economic struggle that's ahead. And this is part of Mahan. And this is part of that larger, obvious logic that the Chinese have understood for a long time. That is, if you can grow your economy and protect it from people who might try to interrupt that trade, if you can grow your trade globally and protect it, then you're going to be a strong economy and you're going to have domestic stability and you're going to keep your party at home, the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party, very popular, or at least popular enough to avoid what happened in 1989, the Tiananmen Square fiasco. And that in the bottom line of Chinese leadership is actually the most important thing of all. Staying in power domestically, making sure that liberal democracy can't get a foothold, as it did in 1989, inside of China and threaten the leadership. And commerce and economic growth of 4 or 3% is the way to go, not 17% decline because we've invaded this island called Taiwan that is so important to certain glory seekers. No. We're going to be more rational than that. And we're going to make sure that the Americans understand that we're more rational so that they don't get worried and don't cut us off from trade. And this is the bottom line. Why I'm optimistic is that leaders can learn from history or learn from, let's say, the evidence that I provide and avoid the mistakes that got them into a situation where both sides have negative expectations of future trade. Or like Japan 41, where one side in particular, the Japanese, are being cut off and they feel they have to start at Pearl Harbor to get Southeast Asia. The Japanese weren't foolish. They were being cut off. They had to act. The Chinese want to avoid the scenario that gets them into a situation where they're being cut off, decoupled as we call it, and that they have to do something nasty to protect their economic security. And if we learn those lessons, then we won't decouple. We will actually encourage the Chinese to grow by 3%, avoid decline, so that they don't get nervous about their future as a party. And we grow by 3%, and both of us grow to the point where nobody fears decline, nobody fears being taken over by the other state, and both sides have domestic stability, which, by the way, the U.S. doesn't really have right now, as you know, but I'm hopeful there that the Americans can grow their economy and stabilize their long-term prospects at home. And both sides will say, all right, steady as she goes, this is good. And let's avoid what happened, say, in 2022 when Russia invaded the Ukraine.
I'm very glad that we're finishing with this optimistic note. Thanks a lot, Dale. This was a great conversation. Let me just remind our audience about your book, A World Safe for Commerce. Super interesting, both the book and this conversation. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, Javier.
Thank you for tuning in today to the Economic and Political History Podcast. Don't forget to stay connected with us on YouTube and Spotify. I'm your host, Javier Mejia from Stanford University. Feel free to follow me on Twitter at Javier Mejia C and connect with me on LinkedIn. You can find me as Javier Mejia Cubillos. Until next time, stay engaged, thank you, and take care.